Hey, how's it going, everyone? So today my wife actually gave me the idea for this video because as a new gamer herself, she thought that it might be helpful for some people out there who are in kind of a similar position as her to kind of get some ideas for what type of games they should or shouldn't really try, or maybe some suggestions for ideas to get into pretty early on. So that's why I have this idea of the 5 video games for beginners. Now, of course, this isn't like an all encompassing list. I haven't played every video game. These are only my opinions, but I really think that these games not only lend well to like new players or people who haven't really played video games that much at all, but it also allows a really good level of introduction into the respective genre, as well as the ability to push that game further to high levels of skill cap. So, all of the games that I put on here have a very, very low barrier to entry. They are easy to understand for the most part, but they also have a very high skill ceiling, meaning that if you want to, as you get better at the game, you can start pushing those harder and harder difficulties of that game, or those harder and harder game modes to really distinguish yourself or show your skill in that game. So, that being said, let's go ahead and get into the 5 video games for beginners. For the first genre, I went with a genre that I am familiar with, that I enjoy a lot, that I play a lot, and that is the simulation genre. Now, simulation games usually focus on like players creating part of the world while they plan it with other inhabitants controlled by artificial intelligence that populate the world. This could be, creating entire cities like you would in, say, SimCity, or creating just a small island where you build it up yourself. You choose what your other inhabitants are, who they are, and then also where to put everything on that island and kind of how it's set up. So there's a lot of variety in this genre, but I think that the number one simulation game for beginners, especially right now, would be Animal Crossing New Horizons. Now, this game was launched right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 by Nintendo. It sold upwards of 30 million copies already. Now, it can't be a coincidence that a game like that has sold so many copies, and that's because it lends well to a very simplistic and casual playstyle. And what I mean by that is that you can kind of play however you want. There's no force in the game that makes you go any kind of hardcore way. Now, there are a lot of people who take it very seriously and dedicate a lot of time to making their island look really nice and collecting everything in the game and doing all that kind of stuff. It's by no means hard in the sense that it's like immediately difficult to do. It can be tedious, however, because some of these things are random chance, but a lot of people like that aspect of the game. It's that simulation aspect where you create this island basically of all these different inhabitants that you want, and then you also get to build up that island however you want to look, where you want the rivers to be. For the most part, there are some things you can't change. You can go diving, you can go, there's little mazes that you can do. There's a lot of different like casual things you can do in the game that kind of add up to this really large ability to create a lot of the world. Now, there are, of course, simulation games that are much more complex, but as a beginner, I would suggest starting with Animal Crossing New Horizons and seeing how you enjoy it. Now, the game is completely soloable, but you can have people invited to your island, other players, your friends, other people who have the game. You can invite them over to your island to run around and play with you and build things with you. And some people have even made little games, although they're not that robust, but the game wasn't really intended to be played that way, but people have forced it in a way to be played that way. So you could look into some things like that, and I think it's really, really interesting. And when you are ready to get into something a little bit more complex, if you really do enjoy this game, then I suggest going into a game like Stardew Valley, which has a lot of that same aspects of you're on this new place in the world that you've never been to and very few people have. You get to build up your farm and do your thing, and then you can also go like mining or monster hunting. So Stardew Valley really feels like the next progression of a game like this, but there's a reason that Animal Crossing New Horizons has sold so many copies, and it's because it lends really well to a very casual playstyle, so you can play it how you want, when you want, and in many different ways. All right, and that leads us into genre number 2, which is going to be the action role playing game, or as it's more often called, an ARPG. So There are other types of RPGs. Of course, there are many. There's an adventure RPG, and then there's some which we'll get down to later on in this list. But the reason I pick action RPG is because there is a lot of games in this genre for one, but also it's a really good way to get people into this idea of playing as something that they're not necessarily. And that could be in real life. So some action RPG games, like you'll play as like a gang member selling drugs, doing crazy stuff in a city. So that would be like a real life thing that exists, but you are not that probably. So you can play as that. Or you could be you're a hero in some fantasy world with dragons and you go around slaying those dragons and stuff like that. So that's where the role playing part of the genre comes from. But most of the games focus on controlling a single person in a world that's generally kind of fantasy or made up in some kind of way, where that player is then tasked to go around doing different missions and quests and kind of exploring the world in that way. And these quests can sometimes be this very straightforward linear storyline where you just go through the game however the developer wrote the story. But then there's also other games in this genre, generally referred to as sandbox, where you have a lot of variety in the type of missions and quests that you choose to do, and you can do them however you want, whenever you want, and sometimes even choosing one quest over another changes the story in that way. Now, the action part of this kind of genre comes from how you control your character, in that you need to be in these real time fights where you have to control your character and react to things as they're happening. And so it can actually get kind of difficult at times, especially if you're new to video games. But that difficulty is a lot of fun. Learning how to play the game, learning how to fight, that's part of what makes an action RPG fun. Now, if you don't like the idea of having to control your character in fights and it can get complicated, then maybe this isn't the genre for you. But I think giving it a try is a good idea, because there are a lot of different ways that most RPGs like this implement combat and stuff like that, allowing people to choose their playstyle. Do you want to be a ranger from way far back? Do you want to be a rogue and be sneaky and stab people from behind? Do you want to be a warrior with a shield and just go straight up to them and fight them that way? They give you a lot of ability in that way. But another thing that this game really does is they make the progression of your character feel really good. So generally you're going to start off pretty weak with no skills and bad weapons, and it's not going to be the best. You're going to be basically a nobody, but then through the game, as you establish yourself as someone within this world and make yourself known to the denizens that live there, then you level up. Usually there's some kind of perk system, so as you level up you can put those points into different abilities, whether that's like magic or archery skill or sneaking skill or whatever it is. It depends on the game, really. But you'll level up through that way, but then you'll also get better weapons and more health and stuff like that. And you'll get more friends in the game that'll help you and stuff like that. So you start off weak and then you usually build up into this very strong, formidable force. And that progression feels really nice. That's part of the genres. Going from zero to hero really is kind of how it goes. At some points you might even be a god slayer in some games. So that's what really lends well with this game. And so for this genre, I think that the best game that you could really start with is going to be Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. If you haven't heard of Skyrim, that would honestly surprise me a lot, since it's been released on pretty much every console that's ever existed. But it was released in 2011 by Bethesda, and since then it's been on Xbox 360, it's been on Xbox One, it's been on PlayStation 3, it's been on PlayStation 4, it's been on the Xbox Series X, it's been on the PlayStation 5, it's been on PC, it's been on the Switch. So pretty much any console you own, you're going to be able to play this game on it. So that's a really major reason that this is a really good beginner RPG. But Skyrim as a game is basically, you are put into this fantasy world with its own unique set of politics, its own unique set of people and races that you can choose from and interact with. And you are then set loose in this world to kill dragons, befriend dragons, kill thieves, become a thief, or help people or kill people, however you see fit. And there's a lot of choice that goes into it. So the reason that I think that Skyrim is such a good choice is because there are very few RPGs that are quite as diverse as Skyrim really is. So you could say that there are simpler ones, sure, but Skyrim has not only a main storyline, which you can follow if you want to, but you're by no means forced to follow. So it kind of has a linear story if you want to, but it also has that sandbox feel where there are many, and I mean many side missions and quests for you to do. And those side missions and quests have dramatic impact on your character, how you view your character, how you play the game, and a bunch of stuff like that. You can do so much in this game. You can buy a house, you can get married. There's a lot of that role playing aspect, but also for that action aspect, there is a lot of player progression paths within Skyrim for choosing how you want to play your character. So much so that you could play through the game multiple times and still not have played through every possible playstyle that exists. There is a lot into this game, and it's very diverse and very versatile. And that's why I think it's really a good starting action RPG that you could get into. Now, of course, for a beginner, the combat might be complex to some degree, but you can always lower the difficulty of the game and choose playstyles that are generally easier for newer players, such as like choosing a sword and shield or going archery instead of going more complex things like thieving or magic or anything like that. So if you don't like that complexity in combat, you can make it so it's less complex. But if you do like the complexity, all of the tools are there for you to really try out your hand in those kinds of aspects. So that is why I think Skyrim is the perfect introduction to ARPGs in general, as well as just a really solid game overall. I mean, there's a reason that, 10 years after its launch, it's still being released on new platforms that come out. So keep that in mind. Okay, and then for the third genre, we have the multiplayer online battle arena, or MOBA for short. I'm sure that a lot of people have probably heard of MOBAs, or at least one of them, League of Legends. So generally, MOBAs are played by two teams, and each of those teams most often has about 5 players each. And they're trying to destroy the other team's base. Now, this might seem pretty simple on the surface, but it can get pretty complicated. So, for example, you have every game you start, every single player chooses a character that they want to play. And those characters have different roles within the game, whether that's tank, marksman, mage, support. You get the idea. It's a very common theme with not only in video games, but also within fantasy and pop culture in general. But also, once you choose your character, every person starts the game at level 1. So every time you start one of these competitive games, you're going to have to start at level 1. And then throughout the game, by killing neutral objectives or NPCs or enemy players, you get gold. And then with that gold, you're able to buy items that increase your character level. And then you also level up and get skills that make you stronger as well. The setup of the game is usually 3 separate lanes and a jungle or center area for roaming around of players, and then you basically go down those lanes or through the jungle towards the enemy base, and it's kind of this tug and pull back and forth until one team destroys the other's base. So it can get really complex pretty quickly, but it is a subgenre of strategy. So if you really like the idea of a real-time strategy game where you're not really controlling armies, you're controlling yourself on a team with other players, this might be the game for you. So for this, I'm going to choose League of Legends as probably the best game to get into as a new player for beginners. And in fact, I would say League of Legends is probably the best MOBA you could get into at any point because it is the most popular, but most of the other MOBAs I've played are actually more complex as well. So, League of Legends was released in 2009 by Riot Games. It is the most popular MOBA and it has the largest esport in the world, and it's free to play. So, with the fact that it is one of the more simple MOBAs out there, it's free to play, it's the most played, and it has a massive esport, I think that makes it a really good game for most people to get into. It is only on PC. There is a mobile version of the game, but it's not the same game. it is a little bit different and it runs on different servers. You'll play with different people. You won't play with people on the PC version of the game. So if you wanted to try it out on mobile, maybe you could try that first, and then if you enjoy it from there, go to PC. But the main game is played on PC, and so if you don't have a PC, maybe this isn't the best option for you, but again, you can try that mobile version you want. Another good thing about League of Legends is there's a large number of characters slash champions in the game, and a lot of different playstyles are represented. So you probably would be able to find a character that really fits well with you in the way that you like to play video games, I would imagine. And there's pretty much an infinite number of guides on the internet that you could use to learn the game. That's another good thing about a game being so popular is there's so many resources for a new person to use in order to learn the game. Now, of course, not being a story-driven game and not having that much that's and having a lot of stuff that's really complex and would require a lot of explaining to do, there's not really much more I can say about League of Legends other than if you like the idea of a 5v5 team game that's a little bit slower than other competitive games and not so fast paced like a shooter like Call of Duty or something like that, then this might be a game for you. And I would strongly suggest giving it a try if that sounds interesting. Okay, so for the fourth genre, we have fighting games. And so fighting games are pretty simple in concept. You have like a 1v1 between you and another player, or sometimes maybe an NPC. And this can sometimes change. For example, you might have a 2v2 or like some kind of like tag team battle, or in the case of platform fighters, you might have a free for all or something like that. Generally, though, you're gonna have to do like a 1v1, and each player is going to want to generally know some combos for each character. So you play a character and then you know button combinations for that character that do specific types of attacks and that lend well into killing the opponent. And then you're going to have to react to the different combos that your enemy might do. So it's pretty simple. It's literally just the like 1v1 me bro kind of game. And it's usually, in fact, it's usually 2D. There's not, they might have like 3D graphics, but it's not like you're running around in circles. You're just going back and forth on the screen. That is the most common form for a fighter to be. There are exceptions. For example, Tekken it's 3D and you run around in circles all over the map. But that's aside the point. The idea is that in concept it's very simple, but in practice and application and implementation, there is a diverse form of this game. There's a lot of different versions of it, and it can be very, very hard to master because there's a lot that you have to know, not just about the characters, but about reading opponents and learning when to block, when not to block, and stuff like that. So if that sounds fun to you, this 1v1 kind of idea, this is going to be the genre for you. This genre of game is ancient. I'm talking like this genre was invented in arcades ancient. Like we have Street Fighter from whenever the first competitions for video games pretty much existed. And so Street Fighter being a staple of this entire genre is of course still alive today, but we also have things like Mortal Kombat and Tekken, but we also have the game that I think is the best to get into for a new player to video games in the fighting genre, and that would be Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Now, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was created by Nintendo and released on the Switch in 2018. And it's basically takes all of Nintendo's IPs. You have Mario, you have Yoshi, you have Kirby, you have Link. It takes a lot of those IPs and then also brings in other ones like Square Enix things like Cloud, or you have even other things that are just completely out of nowhere like Minecraft characters. So it really is like this idea of you have fighters and then you pick your fighter that you want to play from multiple different IPs, and then you go into a battle and you fight with them. And something that makes Super Smash Bros. Kind of special in this sense is that it's really is simple to get into. There's even like it's mostly marketed as like a family game where you can turn on items and they drop and it creates a bit of randomness to the game. So pretty much anyone can win. You can put on handicaps in the game. So it's a little bit more fair if you're playing against a young person or somebody who hasn't really played that game before. But it does also have a really dedicated competitive and esports scene that have their own sets of rules, such as You don't turn on items and you don't do any of those crazy maps. You just have basic battlefield maps so that really the best player wins and there's no randomness that causes someone to lose. Being a fighting game, I think if you like the idea of that 1v1, Super Smash Bros. Is going to be a really good intro to that. They do have an online rating, so you can play against other people online and level up your rating that way, and then go to most places probably have a local scene as well if you want to play locally, so they have that option as well. And if you just want to play with your friends and family in a really casual way, it has that option as well. So I think that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is a really good fighting game to get into. If you don't have a Switch, that's a bit unfortunate because you can really only play it on the Switch, but it probably honestly is worth getting the console if you think you'll play fighting games a lot, because it does have a lot of playability and sometimes it's people's main game, right? So you have like pro players who literally play it all day and that's what they do. So give that one a try if you think fighting games might be your calling. And then number 5, finally, we have the second type of RPG, the massive multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG for short. So if you want that same feeling you get from the action RPG, but you want to experience it with tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of different people online at the same time as you, then this might be the genre that you're looking for. So there are a significant number of overlaps between just normal action RPGs and MMORPGs. You could even say possibly that uh, MMOs are an extension of action RPGs by just making it online, but there are a set of key differences that I think make this genre unique enough to have its own position on the list here. And so I think that would be one. I think that there's a heavy focus on team activities with something that's usually called PvE, or player versus environment, where you get a team of players together to fight non player characters, usually in a dungeon or a raid that is designed and developed by the company who makes the MMO. And you go into those dungeons and raids as a team in the idea of clearing it. And these different monsters in the dungeon sometimes have different attacks and different things that they do that you're going to have to strategize against and come up with together in order to beat it. And so that is one aspect that people really like about MMORPGs, as well as it having a PvP, or player versus player, which is your more traditional competitive game where it's like one set of players versus another set of players. But most often in MMOs, it's just who can kill the other team first, or who can play the objectives better. There is battlegrounds in a lot of MMOs that make it really interesting for how PvP works. The second major difference, I think, is that there is this idea of community, and you join other players together in order to do whatever it is that your group of players likes to do. That could be just chilling out in the major cities, or in some games going to gamble or doing some of the mini games. In some games it could be pushing high-end raids, or in some games it could be, doing really high PvP. So it really depends, but being able to join a community of people within this world that exists alongside you and do things with them as if they were living in this world with you, I think that is a really major draw to MMORPGs. And then number 3, there is this real huge emphasis on collecting things that I don't think really exists in just a normal ARPG, where you're just kind of trying to finish the story and that's it. So in MMOs, there's often mounts, which are like rideable things that you collect, or different armor sets that you collect to make yourself look cool and stuff like that. And that's often a really major focus within MMOs that people often go for to show off their skill, because often these collectibles are gained through doing something hard, or just to show their dedication or anything like that. So those are the 3 major differences I think that make MMORPGs different than ARPGs. And for the MMO that I think is the best for new players to the genre would be Final Fantasy XIV. And Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO that was created by Square Enix and released in 2010. It did have a really, really horrible launch. It was so bad that they actually had to scrap the game and then relaunch it, just in the hopes that people would play it, because the original game was basically unsalvageable. However, with its current position in the market, as well as the release of its new expansion later this year, it's poised to take over the old industry titan of World of Warcraft as the most popular and most played MMORPG in the world. Now, that's not the only reason I think it's really good for new players. Even if it weren't the number one MMORPG, I would still say it would probably be really good as the number one option for new players because it has an incredibly welcoming atmosphere that I would say is not only unique to MMOs, but unique to gaming in general. The community within Final Fantasy XIV really loves the new players in their game. They like new people coming to their game. They have ways of helping new players that come to their game, and they're really generally super nice with helping people out. It also has an incredibly large array of different ways that you can play the game. You can play the game in a very casual sense, just leveling up and doing your own thing like fishing and leveling up those professions and stuff like that. But it also has a lot of rating, so you can do easy rating, you can do really high end rating. It does have forms of PvP. It also has player and group housing, which is really interesting. So with your free company, which is like your group of players, you can have a house or you can have your own house and you can decorate that how you want. There's a high level of collecting in the game, and also most of the game can be soloed, but it doesn't have to be. If you like the idea of doing things by yourself, but with the option of doing things with other players, then this is a really good game because there aren't many parts of it that require a group. There are parts of it that do, but not a lot. And while you're doing that solo leveling, there is a lot of opportunity for you to meet new people in the game and kind of make friends and join free companies that fit your playstyle and what you really want to do. And then from there, you can either continue questing and leveling up with them, or leveling your professions with them, or doing your collecting with them, or whatever, or doing your stuff solo still. So there's a lot of options when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV that I think make it a really good beginner game. It has very nice, casual, friendly ways of doing most things, but then it also has very high end things. So if you do want to push your skill in the game, there is that option. So I think it's really good in that way. And I think that most people joining this game will find it really welcoming and really good for a new player perspective. So that's the list of the 5 video games for beginners. I hope that this inspired somebody to try out a new game or maybe play video games for the first time and really kind of dig into either a specific genre or gaming as a whole. And if you did enjoy this content or found it helpful at all, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean a lot to me and it would be really helpful. And leave a comment down below with other games that you think are really good for beginners, or other genres that you think I should have covered, or possibly your experience with some of these games that I mentioned and whether or not you think those were either good for you or someone you knew as a new player to video games. But that's all for the video. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.